And so we do have enough questions to keep us busy until same time tomorrow. Therefore, let's bring in all of our panelists. Dr. Brian Thomas, Dr. Randy Guliuzza, Dr. Dan Biddle, and okay. Well, that concludes our 4 sessions, Young Earth Creation, Incredible Evidence. I said when we first started promoting this, that this seminar will show exactly why it is a great time to be a biblical creationist. And you brothers did not let us down. Excellent work. Sam, what were your thoughts on those presentations, brother?
Yeah, that was fantastic. I'm thank you for letting me be here, be a part of this. So thank you, gentlemen, for your time.
Welcome.
And work. Time and work. Okay, well, let's get into some questions. What I think we should do for our roughly 20 minutes of questions here. First, I do want to let everybody in the audience know that in many ways, this was a sneak preview into all of these many lines of evidence for young Earth creation and the global flood. So if you do check the description box of this video, which I do encourage you to do, I have all the relevant links to ICR, to Dr. Carl Werner and Dr. Dan Biddle and Genesis Apologetics, where you can find more from them. Their YouTube channels, their websites, really just for endless material that you can benefit from.
Man,
okay, I've got a couple questions, it looks like, for everybody. And so why don't we start with our first presentation, which was you, Dr. Brian Thomas, on dinosaur soft tissue. Some truly fascinating information there. And I think this is a good question. This one came in from Apologetics 101 for Brian. For Brian from Brian. Brian, thank you for the question. What is your take on some of the responses to the blood cells and tissue found inside dinosaur bones? In other words, Dr. Thomas, obviously there's still people out there who are not young Earth creation. They still believe in the billions of years paradigm, but they are aware of this evidence. And so in terms of how they've responded or dealt with that evidence, what have been your feelings or thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to assume that this question really has to do with some of the stories that have come out, or I may say generously call them explanations as to how you can get original tissue or original proteins to last much longer than they can last based on biochemistry. And so that's so that's, I think that's what the questioner is on about. And so I have two responses to that. Number one is there's a long precedent in the literature of researchers arguing in a circle. It's called circular reasoning, and it goes something like this. Number one, we find collagen in these fossils. Number two, this is the second premise. These fossils were deposited 70 million years ago, or insert evolutionary age number. So we find the fossils, they're 70 million years old. Therefore, conclusion, the proteins in those fossils must also be have persisted for 70 million years, period, end of story. Of course, that kind of arguing in a circle, it presumes the very conclusion that it makes. And that's very quite common. And that's in the literature, it's in popular articles as well, and we kind of tend to do that too. So it's helpful for us to make sure that we're not thinking in circles, right? Well, here's what I would insert into that premise one, premise two, and conclusion argument. I would insert a third premise, and the third premise says, but the decay rates disprove the possibility or preclude the possibility that proteins can last that long. And so that's what we're faced with. So when I hear one of my colleagues propose a possible solution to their dilemma, I don't have the dilemma, because in the young Earth, like recent creation, recent flood model, those proteins were deposited thousands, not millions of years ago. So therefore, it's expected that some of them might persist. And lo and behold, there they are. But in order to preserve the deep time, the tens of millions of years, we have these proposed scenarios. Like maybe it was a bunch of extra minerals, or maybe it was a bunch of extra um, iron that stuck onto the tissues, or there's one called what I call the toast model, where the tissues got sort of baked enough to where the outer layer of the tissue turned into a resistant layer. All these proposals, guess what? None of them have been tested. They're all stories. So until we get someone to test them, I feel no compulsion to go with them, because here's if I say that that collagen can last like Dr. Biddle showed 10 times longer than we know it can last based on decay rate studies, then I'm actually going against the second law of thermodynamics that says that systems decay over time, and they get less and less organized over time. So the burden of proof lies on the person who puts forth a model to say, hey, these proteins could have lasted much longer than chemistry says they can last. Well, the burden of proof lies on you to say how, and show me that it does. Do the decay rate experiment. None of them have ever done that experiment. So I'm going to stick with the science, which actually points to the Bible, which suggests that these are all fresh looking.
Well said. Great answer. I like the way you put it, Dr. Thomas. The young Earth creationists like us, we're not the one with the dilemma. The fact that we find these incredible preservations is testimony to a young Earth, and it is contradictory to the billions of years paradigm. And so very good. Let's get one more question based on your presentation, Dr. Thomas. This comes in from N9 Nate. Thank you for the question. For Dr. Thomas, can collagen last over millions of years in extremely perfect, stable preservation conditions? And would there be such conditions if millions of years existed?
Well, as to the first question, I feel like I answered that in the presentation. If you'll watch it again, you'll see that I quoted from secular scientists, and they said that collagen cannot last any longer than 900,000 years in theory, based on the measured decay rate, under ideal conditions. So that's extremely perfect, stable preservation conditions, which means no bacteria, no radiation, those kinds of things. So the only way to get collagen to last over millions of years that I can think of is to get it so cold, like close to 0 degrees Kelvin, so that the chemistry goes so slowly. But of course, we can't even get it down to liquid nitrogen levels on Earth's surface. So that's totally irrational. Which leads me to the second question. Would there be such conditions if millions of years existed? Well, the more time you give a system, the more opportunities you give that system, especially a system of chemicals, to undergo chemistry, which happens relentlessly. So the more time you give it, the more chemistry happens, and the more opportunities you give that chemical, i.e. collagen or any other biochemical, to undergo chemistry and then turn into dust, as it were.
Isn't that incredible? 900,000 years in perfect, extremely stable conditions. And even that is far less than the millions of years that they would need to explain. Sam, you said you had a quick follow-up, brother?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, perhaps a critic might respond that it could have been contaminated with something that would preserve it in some way. So on its own terms, yeah, we understand that these things would decay. But is it possible that something like iron or something was contaminated into the biological material, which helped the preservation process?
Well, I suppose it's theoretically possible, but so the burden of proof lies on the person who's proposing that, right? Like What is it that could contaminate this? Something that's available when the creature's deposited. And what is it that, what contaminant could actually do preservation? And we don't know of any. um, maybe there was a giant bucket of formaldehyde that covered the earth and helped preserve these things. But if that were to have happened, even that, what does formaldehyde do? It's called cross-linking. So you have a protein here, and it does extra chemistry to bind those proteins together and turn them into no longer a protein, but some sort of a mass, a jumbled mass of polymer, okay, which might last longer. But guess what? We have evidence. We're not finding polymerized proteins as often as we're finding the original proteins themselves and even sequencing them. So you can have, you can have a dump truck or a cement mixer the size of the moon filled with formaldehyde, dump it on the earth over eons and do all this, cross-linking. But you still, what would you end up with? Well, you'd end up with cross-linked biomaterials, but that's not what we find. We find a little bit of that, not due to formaldehyde, but due to heat, basically. But what we actually sequence, what we actually detect, what we actually find is the original proteins, fragments of them, bits of them that we would expect to still remain if they were there for only thousands of years.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, I love it, Dr. Thomas. I really appreciate those responses. Again, it is an amazing time to be a biblical creationist. Great stuff. So, okay, we got a couple questions now for Dr. G. Dr. G, thank you as well for your excellent presentation on a very important topic. And so I'll bring in the first question, and I can provide some context as well, as this is a common one. Does CET, continuous environmental tracking, explain post-flood speciation or variation? So in other words, Dr. G, critics of the young earth creation position, they will oftentimes assert that we believe in hyper evolution or hyper speciation because they explain all the variations in species in the world through evolutionary processes, right? Natural selection, mutations, so on and so forth. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, Dr. G, and if your model has some good explanatory power on explaining that. Oh, actually, just one sec. Let me make sure your audio. Okay, Dr. G, you're good.
Yeah, the answer is, of course it does, because the main criticism that you just mentioned is the word hyper. They believe that we would have to explain rapid changes in just a very short period of time. So, following in the tradition of Dr. Thomas, I'll have two parts to this answer right here. First is a lot of what they're talking about in terms of evolution probably really isn't evolution during that period of time. In other words, evolving from a creature like Pakicetus to regular seagoing whales really didn't happen. So there's no need to have to explain those kinds of scenarios with the CET model. But in terms of the diversification that you see, particularly as illustrated by Dr. Werner's skulls, he showed you all of those skulls by the dogs, for example. Many of those changes can be explained by mechanisms that are not just pure genetic mechanisms. As I mentioned in my slide, there are many different ways in which organisms vary and adapt, and not just pure changes to the DNA. And some of those changes that are in those dog skulls are due to epigenetic changes, and others are due to changes in terms of just tandem repeats and other factors in the genome without actually changing the genes for the coding proteins as well. So since CET encompasses many, many different mechanisms, genetic mechanisms, epigenetic mechanisms, other types of non-genetic but heritable changes and so on, it's quite robust in explaining post-flood speciation and variation.
So is there a lot of morphological adaptability built in to each kind that can come about rapidly as you've been putting forth due to environmental changes after the flood?
When you say a lot of course, that means within specific parameters. And some people will confuse the term continuous environmental tracking, the word continuous, which is a time-related term relating to the fact that they are doing it all the time, with an extent expression that it's implying that there's unlimited amount of change, but that's not true. It's an engineering-based approach, so everything operates within specific parameters, including variability and adaptation. So, yes, there is a lot of potential, which probably hasn't even been completely expressed yet, in these creatures as they detect different environmental conditions. And because there is a capacity built in up front, they're able to express different traits towards that. And the capacity is not strictly genetic capacity. And everybody fixates on the genes, but the capacity that the Lord has built in is more than just changing specific genes. It's changing expression of the genes through epigenetic mechanisms. It's changing behavioral things. There's many different ways. I published a paper in the 2017 International Conference on Creationism, myself and Phil Gaskell, where in the appendix it lists 22 different mechanisms that are in the literature for expressing these type of changes, including somatic to germline changes, where cells in your body tissue, which are called somatic cells, are actually capable of transmitting information into developing germ cells, which are your sperm and egg cells. So there are many different mechanisms to express this capacity.
That's awesome. I appreciate that response to a very common challenge, Dr. G, and I think clearly we have a great answer to it. And so here's the second one, another common one put forth by proponents of evolution. How does the CET model explain arguments from junk DNA, but specifically dealing with shared pseudogenes, aka genetic mistakes? A little more context, the evolutionists will say, well, we share these mutations or these genetic mistakes with the chimpanzee, for example, and therefore we must have inherited those from a common ancestor in the past.
Right. Well, I'm glad we're finally, actually, just as a preface, getting some questions on biology, because in many respects, in terms of creation evolution, biology is really the name of the game. Yeah. And for so long, we've focused on geology, because in some ways that's the low-hanging fruit. And it's dealing with the age of the earth, and the geology, in some ways, dealing with the layers is not the difficult challenge that we have to take on, which is Darwin's theory, which was to explain the design of organisms. And it's really the design of organisms which is general revelation, indicating that there really is a creator. And two, it's the incredible design of organisms which shows the wisdom and the power and the genius of the Lord Jesus Christ and expresses his glory. And that's why creationists should really be concerned with the biological arguments, because that's really what Darwin is after in attacking and pointing out there is no creator. And so we really need to be getting down to developing theories which explain these features that we find in ways that glorify the Lord. And one of the presuppositions that evolutionists have is this concept of junk DNA, or there are mistakes. And I don't know why anybody would continue to push this, because on nearly every website by every creationist ministry, there are literally dozens of articles dealing with the whole idea of junk DNA, which is rapidly falling apart. The idea that there are all of these mistakes built into the genome, when in reality, it was just ignorance of people that didn't understand what this information was all about. And now, most evolutionists, I can't say in a number, are completely abandoning, at least in terms of their literature, the whole concept of junk DNA. And one of the evidence of junk DNA were pseudogenes. In other words, these were genes which were considered to be functional at one time and were broken and lost their function. and somehow got repeated due to copying from one common ancestor to another, as you mentioned, between us and chimpanzees. But just like most of the arguments for junk DNA, the pseudogene argument is also falling apart as we find function for one so-called pseudogene after another. We have multiple articles on our webpage at icr.org about pseudogenes, and there were large articles published in the Creation Research Society quarterly about pseudogenes as well. And so I don't stipulate to the premise that these are genetic mistakes at all. We find function for many of these, and what I would suggest is within an engineering-based framework where we assume that these things have function up front, that we continue to research for those functions of these so-called pseudogenes as well. It doesn't necessarily relate specifically to the CET model, but in terms of what we should be looking for as creationists.
That's a great answer, Dr. G. I appreciate you engaging those questions.